Pilots couldn't land damaged plane until a former military man stood up and... Colonel Michael Thompson gripped the controls tightly as sweat dripped down his forehead. At 32, he had over 1,000 flight hours, but he had never faced a situation like this on Flight 8315 of the national airline, traveling from New York to Miami. That's when he heard the first alarm sound in the cockpit. The main hydraulic system had completely failed, leaving the aircraft with only partial controls. In seat 14A, Richard Harrison discreetly observed the nervous movements of the crew through the slightly open first-class curtain. "Dad, what's happening?" whispered Jennifer, his 45-year-old daughter, seated beside him. She had insisted on accompanying him on this trip to Miami, where he was to be honored for his 50 years of service in the U.S. Air Force. "Some technical issue," murmured Richard, recognizing the signs he had learned to identify decades ago. His experienced hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the arthritis he tried to hide from his daughter. In the cockpit, co-pilot David Wilson frantically checked the digital manuals while Colonel Michael struggled to stay calm. Both were young, trained in the era of modern aviation, where computers solved most problems. "Colonel, the flaps aren't responding, and the landing gear is only partially functional," reported David, his voice tense. "What do you mean, partially?" "Only the nose wheel deployed, the main ones are stuck." Michael felt his stomach twist. In all his years of experience, he had never faced a multiple failure like this. Modern simulators were sophisticated, but nothing prepared a pilot for the real pressure of an emergency, with 156 lives on board. Flight attendant Sarah Miller tried to maintain an air of normalcy as she served snacks, but her movements were stiffer than usual. Some passengers were starting to notice something was wrong. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, remembering 1985, when he had flown a military Flytech that suffered a similar failure over the Alaskan wilderness. Back then, there were no automated systems to fix the problem. Everything was manual, based on experience and instinct. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. "Jennifer," Richard said, gently touching his daughter's arm, "I need to use the restroom." She nodded, unaware of her father's true intentions. Richard stood slowly, his figure still imposing despite his 72 years. His grey sweater was damp with sweat, not from heat but from the growing anxiety as he watched the situation worsen. Walking down the aisle, Richard noticed other troubling details. The plane had a slight tilt to the right, and he could feel faint vibrations in the floor, signaling the pilot's struggle with the controls. Passing the galley, he overheard Sarah whispering to another flight attendant. "Jason, they asked us to prepare for a possible emergency landing," she murmured, "but they don't know where or when." "What about the passengers?" "Nothing for now. The colonel doesn't want to cause panic." Richard stopped in his tracks. An emergency landing with no location or time meant the situation was worse than he thought. He looked out the window and recognized the landscape. They were flying over the Florida Everglades, still far from any major airport. Without another moment's hesitation, he walked to the cockpit and knocked lightly on the reinforced door. "Crew, I'd like to speak with you," he said in a firm but respectful voice. On the other side, Michael and David exchanged confused glances. It was protocol not to allow passengers in the cockpit during emergencies, but something in the man's voice made them hesitate. "Sir, please return to your seat," Michael replied through the intercom. "Captain, my name is Richard Harrison. I'm a retired colonel from the United States Air Force. I have 47 years of experience flying military and civilian aircraft. I believe I can help." There was silence on the other end. Michael recognized that name. Richard Harrison was a legend in American aviation, known for saving countless impossible situations during his military career. "Mr. Harrison," Michael said, opening the door. "Please, come in." Richard entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation. The alarms blared constantly, red lights flashed across the panels, and both pilots were visibly tense. "What's the status?" he asked with the natural authority of someone who had commanded hundreds of flights. "The main hydraulic system has completely failed," David explained. "We only have the manual backup system, but the flaps are jammed and the main landing gear won't lower." Richard studied the instruments. It was the exact same type of failure he had faced decades ago, but in a much more modern and complex aircraft. Captain Michael, how long have you been flying? 7 years, sir. Over 1,000 flight hours. And you, First Officer? David Wilson. 4 years, 800 hours. Richard nodded. They were competent pilots, but all their experience was based on automated systems. When those systems failed, they were lost. May I see the emergency manuals? Michael hesitated. Allowing a passenger, even an experienced one, to interfere with procedures went against every rule, but the situation was spiraling out of control, and he knew he needed help. Here, he said, handing over the tablet with the digital procedures. Richard quickly skimmed through the pages. As he suspected, the modern manuals assumed at least one hydraulic system would remain functional. There were no procedures for a complete failure like this. Captain, these manuals won't help. You'll have to fly by the seat of your pants like we did before computers. What do you mean? Raw force. Use only the mechanical emergency controls and trust your instincts. Michael's stomach tightened. His entire training was based on following specific procedures. The idea of flying by the seat of his pants terrified him. Mr. Harrison, with all due respect, we have to follow the airline's protocols, David said. Protocols won't save you now, son. I've seen this situation before. In 1985, over the Alaskan wilderness with a Flytech loaded with medical supplies. Richard stopped abruptly. That mission had been one of the most traumatic moments of his career. He had managed to land the plane, but one of the engines caught fire during touchdown. No one was seriously hurt, but the experience haunted him to this day. What happened? Michael asked, noticing the shift in the veteran's tone. We landed, but it was close. Too close. The plane jerked sharply to the right, forcing Michael to fight the yoke to maintain control. The stall alarm began blaring. "We're losing lift," David shouted. Richard acted on instinct. He placed his hands over Michael's on the yoke and helped counter the jerk. "Like this, with force. Don't fight the plane, work with it." Together, they managed to stabilize the aircraft temporarily. Michael looked at the veteran with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "How did you know exactly what to do?" "Experience, son. When computers fail, all you have left is human experience." Jennifer, still in her seat, began to sense something was wrong. The plane was clearly unstable, making movements that weren't normal. Other passengers were growing nervous too. An elderly woman, Mrs. Margaret, grabbed Jennifer's arm. "Sweetheart, this plane is having trouble, isn't it?" Jennifer tried to stay calm, though her heart was racing. "I'm sure it's just turbulence, Mrs. Margaret," but she knew it wasn't. Her father had spent his whole life flying, and she had learned to recognize the signs of trouble in an aircraft. In the cockpit, Richard studied the instruments intently. The situation was worsening by the minute. "How much fuel do we have?" "About 2 hours worth," replied David. "And the nearest airport?" "Fort Myers is roughly 90 miles away, but it's a small runway." Richard knew Fort Myers Airport well. He had landed there many times during military missions in the 90s. The runway was short but adequate for an emergency. "That's where we're landing," he said firmly. "Mr. Harrison, with all due respect, this aircraft needs a longer runway. Fort Myers doesn't have the proper emergency equipment," argued Michael. "Son, you're thinking like a modern commercial pilot. Bigger airports mean more flight time, more fuel wasted on maneuvers we can't afford. Fort Myers is our only chance." Richard grabbed the radio and tuned to Fort Myers control tower. His voice took on the authoritative tone of a colonel he hadn't used in years. "Fort Myers Tower, this is Colonel Richard Harrison, retired USAF, aboard Commercial Flight 8315. We have a serious emergency and need to land immediately." The response came quickly. "Colonel Harrison, is that really you? This is Controller Robert Johnson. I remember you from the humanitarian missions in the 90s. "Robert, yes, it's me. Listen carefully. We have complete hydraulic failure on a Boeing 737. We'll need every emergency team you've got." "Understood, Colonel. Clearing the runway now. But, sir, our runway is only 8,000 feet. "I know. I've landed bigger planes on shorter runways. We'll make it." Michael listened to the exchange with growing unease. His training told him this was madness, but the veteran's confidence was contagious. Mr. Harrison, assuming we make it to Fort Myers, how do we land without the main landing gear? Belly landing, done it before. Belly landing? That's insanely dangerous. More dangerous than trying to reach Miami with limited fuel and faulty controls? Son, sometimes the least risky option is the one that seems the most dangerous. Richard knew he wasn't telling the whole truth. A belly landing was extremely risky, especially with passengers on board, but it was their only realistic option. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to the story. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. Some passengers screamed, and Sarah had to grab the aisle to steady herself. "Everyone, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts," she announced over the PA, fighting to keep her voice steady. Jennifer looked out the window and noticed they were flying lower than usual. The Florida Everglades landscape was passing dangerously close. "Sarah," she called as the flight attendant passed. "What's really happening?" Sarah hesitated. She knew Jennifer from other flights. She always traveled with her father to aviation events. "We're having some technical issues, but everything's under control," she replied, sticking to protocol. "My father's been in the cockpit for over 20 minutes. He wouldn't be there if it were just a technical issue." Sarah lowered her voice. "We've lost hydraulic systems. Your father is helping the pilots." Jennifer felt her blood run cold. Hydraulic failure was one of the most dangerous situations in aviation. She knew this because she had grown up listening to her father's stories. In the cockpit, Richard was explaining to the pilots how to perform an emergency landing. "First, we need to burn as much fuel as possible. A lighter aircraft is safer for a belly landing." "How do we do that?" asked David. "By flying in circles around Fort Myers. We'll stay in the air for another hour, burning fuel and testing the manual controls." Jason was still reluctant. "Mr. Harrison, can I speak frankly? This goes against everything I've learned. Procedures exist for a reason. Son, let me tell you something. In 1987, a very experienced pilot tried to land a DC-10 with hydraulic failure by following all the procedures. Result? 111 people lost their lives. Know why? Why? Because procedures are made for normal situations. When everything goes wrong, you have to improvise. That's what separates an average pilot from an exceptional one." Jason reflected on those words. His career had been built on procedures and protocols, but maybe there were moments when human experience was more valuable than any manual. "All right, what do we need to do?" Richard smiled for the first time since entering the cockpit. "First, we'll inform the passengers. They deserve to know the truth." "The airline won't like that," murmured David. "The airline isn't up here with us. The passengers are." Jason picked up the intercom microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Thompson speaking. We're experiencing some technical issues with our hydraulic systems, but we have the situation under control. We'll be making an emergency landing at Fort Myers Airport. Please pay attention to the crew's instructions." A murmur of concern spread through the cabin. Mrs. Margaret clutched Jennifer's arm again. "I knew it! This plane has serious problems." Jennifer tried to calm her, but she was terrified too. An emergency landing meant the situation was very serious. Sarah and Jason began explaining the emergency procedures: brace positions, exit locations, oxygen mask use if needed. One passenger, a retired engineer named Walter, raised his hand. "Captain, I'm a mechanical engineer. I know about hydraulic systems. Can I help in any way?" Richard looked at Jason, who nodded. "Come up here, sir," said Jason. Walter made his way to the cockpit, struggling due to the aircraft's instability. "What kind of failure is it?" he asked as soon as he entered. "Main system completely out. Auxiliary partially functioning," explained David. Walter quickly examined the instruments. "This isn't a random failure. It looks like sabotage or a manufacturing defect." "How so?" asked Richard. "Redundant hydraulic systems don't fail simultaneously without an external cause. Either there was an explosion or someone deliberately damaged the system." A heavy silence filled the cockpit. The possibility of sabotage made everything even scarier. "The cause doesn't matter right now," said Richard, taking back control. "What matters is landing this plane safely." But the seed of doubt had been planted. If someone had sabotaged the plane, why? And who? Jennifer, still in her seat, began recalling strange details from the trip. The day before, her father had mentioned receiving threatening calls related to his work as an airport security consultant. "Dad, someone might not like your work investigating security flaws," she had said. "Nonsense, sweetheart. It's just frustrated business owners who had issues with authorities after my reports." Now Jennifer wondered if those threats could be more serious than they'd imagined. In the cockpit, Richard was coordinating the descent to Fort Myers. The landscape of the Florida Everglades stretched out below them, with the city appearing on the horizon. Fort Myers Tower, this is Flight 8315, beginning approach. 8315, runway is clear. Emergency teams are in position. Colonel, are you certain about the belly landing? Richard hesitated for a second. He wasn't absolutely sure of anything, but it was their only option. Affirmative, Robert. It's our only chance. The aircraft was now just 1,000 feet above the ground. Richard instructed Michael on how to compensate for the lack of flaps using only the elevators and ailerons. Approach speed will be higher than normal, about 180 knots instead of 150. Won't that make the landing even more dangerous? Yes, but without flaps we have no choice. Lift is reduced. We need more speed. Walter, who had been observing, made a suggestion. What if we ask the passengers to move to the rear of the aircraft? It would shift the center of gravity and might help with the landing. Richard considered the idea. It could work, but it's risky to move people during the approach. More risky than landing with the wrong center of gravity? Richard made the decision. Michael, tell the passengers to move to the back quickly but carefully. Michael made the announcement. There was confusion and nervousness, but the passengers complied. Jennifer helped Mrs. Margaret move, keeping her calm during the process. "My dear, where is your father?" the elderly woman asked. "Helping the pilots, Mrs. Margaret. He knows what he's doing." "I hope so, because this plane is shaking terribly." The redistribution of passengers helped stabilize the aircraft. Richard felt the difference in the controls immediately. "Good thinking, Walter. It's better now." They were now just 500 feet above the ground, and the Fort Myers runway was clearly visible. It was shorter than Michael was used to, but Richard seemed confident. "Remember, we're going to touch down on the belly of the aircraft. There will be sparks, noise, and a lot of friction. But if we do it right, we'll stop before the end of the runway." "What if we don't?" David asked. "We won't," Richard replied with a conviction he didn't fully feel. At 200 feet, a new problem arose. The right engine began fluctuating in power. "What's happening now?" Michael asked, watching the engine indicators waver. Walter checked the data. "Looks like the hydraulic failure also affected the engine controls. Air is getting into the fuel system." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the flight in 1985. The engine had failed in exactly the same way that day. "Are we going to have to land with just one engine?" "No. We'll shut down both engines before landing. It's safer." "Shut down the engines?" Michael was horrified. "That's suicide." "No, son. It's caution. Engines running during a belly landing could explode. Better to glide without power than blow up on the ground." Michael felt his hands shaking. All of this was beyond his training and experience. I don't know if I can do this." Richard placed a hand on the young pilot's shoulder. "Michael, look at me. You can do this. I'll be right here beside you. We'll do it together." "But what if?" "There's no what if. There's only what we're going to do, and we're going to land this plane safely." The confidence in the veteran's voice was contagious. Michael took a deep breath and nodded. "All right. What do I need to do?" "First, cut the engines when I say so, then follow my landing instructions exactly." The runway was now just 100 feet below them. Emergency crews were positioned along the runway, ready to act. "Now, Michael, cut the engines." With trembling hands, Michael shut down both engines. The silence that followed was deafening, only the sound of wind rushing past the fuselage. "Perfect. Now keep the nose slightly up. We'll touch down with the belly first, then lower the nose gently." The aircraft glided toward the runway like a massive glider. Richard Harrison took over the auxiliary controls, his experienced hands compensating for every gust of wind. 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. Now! The belly of the aircraft hit the runway with a metallic thud. Sparks flew in all directions as friction with the asphalt began slowing the plane down. Inside the passenger cabin, screams and prayers erupted. Jennifer held Margaret's hand tightly. "It's going to be okay, it's going to be okay," she repeated like a mantra. The aircraft slid down the runway for over half a mile before finally coming to a stop, just 600 feet short of the runway's end. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, an explosion of applause and relieved cheers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now back to the story. "We did it," David shouted, hugging Michael. Richard, exhausted, leaned against the cockpit wall. His hands trembled now, not just from arthritis, but from the adrenaline rush. "Well done, boys. You did an excellent job." Michael looked at the veteran with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Harrison, you saved our lives, all of them." "No, son. We saved them, all of us together." Emergency crews quickly arrived at the aircraft. Stairs were positioned at the emergency exits to evacuate the passengers. Jennifer was among the first to leave, immediately running toward the cockpit to find her father. Dad, are you okay?" Richard smiled when he saw his daughter. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just doing my job." "What job? You've been retired for 5 years. Ah, you know, once a pilot, always a pilot." She hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was going to lose you." "No, honey. Not today." But Richard knew there was more to uncover. The suspicion of sabotage still nagged at him. In the days that followed, investigations confirmed it had indeed been sabotage. A disgruntled mechanic, fired from the airline after Richard reported his negligence in maintenance, had deliberately damaged the hydraulic system. "He wanted to hurt me," Richard explained to Jennifer as they sat in their Fort Myers hotel, "but he never imagined I'd be on that flight." "So you mean he tried to—" "Yes. He was willing to endanger 156 people just to get back at me." Jennifer felt a mix of anger and sadness. "What now?" "Now he'll answer for his crimes, but the important thing is, everyone's safe." At the airport, Michael and David sought out Richard before their departure. "Mr. Harrison," Michael said, "I don't know how to thank you. You taught us more in 2 hours than we learned in years of training. Boys, you've got talent. You just needed to trust your instincts more." "Would you consider teaching at the aviation school?" David asked. "I'm sure other pilots would love to learn from your experience." Richard considered the offer. He'd retired thinking his time had passed, that modern pilots didn't need old-timers like him. "Maybe that's not a bad idea," he replied. "Maybe it's time to pass on what I've learned." Jennifer smiled when she heard that. She saw her father finding new purpose in life. 3 months later, Richard was giving lectures on crisis management in aviation. His first class included Michael and David, who became his most dedicated students. During one lesson, a young pilot asked, "Professor Harrison, how do you stay so calm in emergencies?" Richard took a moment before answering. "Son, it's not that I don't feel fear. Fear is always there. But experience teaches you that panic kills, while action saves lives. When you focus on what you can do instead of what could go wrong, you find solutions. But what if there are no solutions? There are always solutions. Sometimes they're not the ones we want, but there's always something that can be done. The important thing is to never give up." After class, Jennifer was waiting outside. "How was it?" she asked. "Good. These young folks are smart. They just need to learn to trust experience." "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That day on the plane, were you really sure it would work out?" Richard smiled and shook his head. "No, sweetheart, I wasn't sure of anything. But I had to act like I was. Leadership is sometimes just that, appearing confident when you're terrified inside." "And were you terrified?" "Very. Not for myself, but for you and everyone else on board." They walked in silence for a moment. "Dad, thank you for saving all of us that day. Sweetheart, thank you for giving me a reason to fight." 6 months later, the story of Flight 8315 had become legend in the US Air Force. Richard received many honors, but the one he cherished most was a photo on his desk. Him standing with Michael, David, and all the passengers from the flight, taken on the graduation day of the first class of pilots he trained. Margaret, who had become friends with Jennifer after the incident, often visited the flight school to talk to the young pilots. "You know," she always said, "that man didn't just save us that day. He taught us that experience and wisdom never go out of style." Michael, now an instructor at the same school, always ended his lessons with the same phrase he'd learned from Richard. "Remember, technology fails, procedures have limits, but human experience and courage never fail." And Richard, at 73, had found a new purpose in life. He wasn't flying anymore, but he was shaping the next generation of pilots with the values he'd learned over decades in the skies. "You know, Jennifer," he said one morning as they prepared a new lesson, "I thought my time had passed, that the modern world didn't need old pilots like me anymore. And now I know experience doesn't age. It just gets refined." Jennifer smiled, watching her father organize the lesson materials with the same meticulous care he'd always given to flight preparations. "Dad, can I ask you one more thing?" "As many as you want." "Do you miss flying?" Richard looked out the classroom window, where small aircraft took off and landed at the nearby airport. "Every day, but you know what I've realized?" "What?" "Teaching someone to fly is almost as thrilling as flying. Maybe even more, because you're multiplying the experience." Just then, Michael walked in carrying a folder of reports. "Professor Harrison, I've got news." "Go ahead, son." "The school board approved a new course, Extreme Emergency Management. They want you to lead it." Richard felt a wave of satisfaction. Finally, his experience would be formalized and passed on. "I accept, but on one condition." "What?" "You two," he pointed to Michael and David, who had just entered, "will be my assistants. I want you to teach, too." "But, Professor, our experience doesn't compare to yours," David protested. "Son, you faced a real emergency and came out victorious. That's worth more than 1,000 hours in a simulator. Plus, you speak the language of modern pilots better than I do." And so began the course that would become the standard in North America for aviation emergency training. The method blended Richard's hands-on experience with Michael and David's modern technical knowledge. The first group of students included pilots from various national airlines. On the first day of class, Richard shared the full story of Flight 8315. "The question you should ask yourselves," he concluded, "isn't what to do if the systems fail, but what to do when the systems fail. Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when." One of the students raised his hand. "Professor, how do we develop the instincts you showed that day?" "Varied experience, son. Don't just fly one type of aircraft. Don't just fly in perfect conditions. Seek challenging situations within safe limits. And most importantly, never stop learning." After that first class, Jennifer met her father in the parking lot. "How does it feel being a teacher?" "The same as it felt being a pilot. Useful." "And the students?" "They remind me of myself at their age. Full of technical knowledge but with little hands-on experience. I'll help them bridge that gap." 2 years after the Flight 8315 incident, Richard's school had already trained over 200 pilots specialized in emergency management. Several critical situations had been successfully resolved using techniques he developed. During an international aviation conference in New York, Richard was invited to give the keynote speech. The auditorium was packed with pilots, mechanics, and executives from the global aviation industry. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "modern aviation is a miracle of technology. Our planes are safer, more efficient, and more reliable than ever. But there's one thing technology can't replace: human judgment in a crisis." He recounted the story of Flight 8315, explaining each decision he made and why. "What we learned that day," he concluded, "was that experience and technology aren't opposites. They complement each other. Technology takes us far, but when it fails, only human experience can bring us back." The speech was followed by a 5-minute standing ovation. Many pilots approached him afterward to thank him and share their own experiences. Among them was a British pilot who had faced a similar situation over the Atlantic. "Mr. Harrison," he said in slightly broken English, "your story gave me the courage to trust my experience more and rely less on computers alone. That's the most important lesson, my friend. Computers are excellent tools, but they don't replace human judgment. That evening at the hotel, Jennifer asked her father, "How does it feel being internationally famous?" "Famous?" Richard laughed. "Sweetheart, I'm not famous. I'm just an old pilot who was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time." "Dad, you saved 156 lives and are changing global aviation. That's not luck." "Maybe you're right. But do you know what makes me proudest?" "What?" "Seeing young men like Michael and David becoming leaders. They've learned that experience matters, and now they're passing that on. And the school. The school is my legacy. When I'm gone, it'll keep training pilots who understand that technology and experience work together." 5 years after Flight 8315, Richard celebrated his 77th birthday at the school that bore his name. Hundreds of former students attended, including Michael and David, who now ran branch schools in other states. Margaret, now 89 but still sharp, was the guest of honor. "Professor Harrison," she said in her speech, "you didn't just save us that day. You taught us that age isn't a limitation when you have purpose." Michael took the microphone next. "Professor, when we first met, I was just a competent commercial pilot. You taught me to be a complete aviator. The difference is that pilots follow procedures. Aviators make decisions." David added, "And you taught us that leadership isn't about commanding, it's about serving." That day, sir, you served us all. At the end of the celebration, Richard was alone with Jennifer in the school garden. "Dad, do you have any regrets?" "Just one." "What is it?" "It took me too long to realize that teaching is just as important as doing." "But you did realize it." "Yes, and that made all the difference. You know, Jennifer, I always thought my contribution to aviation ended when I retired. Now I know it was only just beginning." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the planes take off and land at the nearby airport. "Dad, what would you say to a young person starting in aviation today?" Richard thought carefully before answering. "I'd say 3 things. First, respect technology, but don't rely on it alone. Second, seek varied experience, not just flight hours. And third, never stop learning, because aviation is always evolving. And for someone my age, that it's never too late to find a new purpose." I was 72 when I saved that flight, and 73 when I started teaching. The best years of my life began when I thought they were already over. Jennifer smiled and hugged her father. "Thank you for teaching me that too. Thank you for always being by my side, my dear. Your presence on that flight gave me the strength to do what was necessary." When they got home that night, Richard found a letter that moved him deeply. It was from a Canadian pilot who had faced an emergency over the Rocky Mountains using techniques learned at the school. "Mr. Harrison." The letter read, "Thanks to your teachings, I safely landed an aircraft with engine failure over the mountain range. 89 people are alive today because you dedicated your experience to teaching other pilots. I don't know how to thank you." Richard showed the letter to Jennifer. "See this, my dear. This is what makes everything we do here important." "How so?" "Every pilot we train can save hundreds of lives over their career. It's an exponential multiplication of good." "And you still think you're not famous?" Richard laughed. "Maybe I'm famous in the aviation world, but more importantly, I'm useful." Just then, the phone rang. It was Michael. "Professor, sorry to call so late, but I have important news." "Go ahead, son." "The International Pilots Association wants to create a certification based on our curriculum. It would be recognized worldwide." Richard felt a wave of pride and satisfaction. "Does that mean our work will reach pilots all over the world?" "Exactly. And they want you to be the program's lead consultant." After hanging up, Richard looked at Jennifer. "I guess I still can't really retire." "Dad, you're 77. When will you rest?" "My dear, I've learned that rest isn't about stopping work. Rest is working on something you love that makes a difference in people's lives. And that's what you're doing? Every single day." That night, before bed, Richard reflected on the journey that had begun on that terrible, transformative day of Flight 8315. What could have been a tragedy became the starting point for a new chapter of his life, richer and more meaningful than any before. He thought of the hundreds of pilots he'd trained, the lives they might save in the future, and the satisfaction of knowing his experience would live on through them long after he was gone. As he drifted off to sleep, Richard smiled. At 77, he had finally discovered his true mission in life, not just to fly, but to teach others to fly with wisdom, courage, and humanity. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Do you believe Richard made the right decisions in that moment of crisis? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.